Now Patrick Hannan and his guests look back at some of the week's events in Junction.
Some people are never satisfied. First of all, they complain about excessive secrecy in public life, and then complain again when school league tables are published, giving us new information. But perhaps they're not really telling us anything we didn't already know, or at least that we couldn't have worked out for ourselves. I think, too, that most of us can have an educated guess at what's likely to be the outcome of yet another government attempt at some form of pay policy. And we certainly now know more about the secrets of the poet Philip Larkin, but that's provoked a different kind of argument, whether or not he should have been allowed to take his private views to the grave. With me to discuss these matters are the journalist and broadcaster Vincent Hanna, Times columnist Matthew Parris, and Peter Stead, who's an historian. Well, it's been just like old times this week.
Major plea for pay restraint.
Not only that, but...
Bosses must freeze their pay, says PM.
I looked twice, but sure enough, those shocking words really were there. It's so long since anyone said pay restraint or pay freeze, I felt sure they'd been removed from the political dictionary. But no.
Costs must be controlled everywhere, not just on the shop floor, but in the boardroom too.
Sometimes I think that Mr. Major's problems stem from the fact that he's too innocent to be in politics. His view was that those with jobs should make sacrifices to help those without. This is either dangerously socialist or a cricket team pep talk.
I believe there is an instinct for fairness in the British character that will understand that and accept it.
Of course there is. That's no doubt why on the same day we learned that this year...
National Power Chairman John Baker's salary soared 161% to £383,935.
And?
Tesco boss Sir Ian McLaurin, whose checkout girls earn around £7,000, went up 45% to £564,000.
And there were further examples from the financial institutions of their willingness to pull together for the sake of the national good.
Get 'em down!
The banks and building societies are deliberately putting the boot into Britain.
Was the Daily Star's view of the apparent failure of these organisations to pass the benefit of interest rate cuts onto their customers. As you might expect, the Sun started hysterical and worked its way up.
We need our money today. We need it to spend in the shops. We don't need to be ripped off by men who make skunk smell sweet.
Well, Vincent Hanna, it is quite amazing to hear those words, restraint and freeze and so on. It seems that all governments, or nearly all governments, eventually arrive at the same point and the same conclusion.
Well, the thing is, I'm not sure that that's true, Patrick, because I think every government talks about restraint and freezes. It's in the British character. There's something about getting people to be restrained as long as it's not you. And the thing about the British is that it's always the servants who get it first. You let the second housemaid go or fire the third gamekeeper when times get hard, and it's exactly what the government does. They say we should have restraint. Now, we're not going to have a pay policy, because pay policies, you see, means that people get more money, you understand, although in a slightly more orderly way. What we have is pay restraint, and the first thing they do is, when they announce there isn't a pay policy, is to make sure that the civil servants and the people whom the government pay get no money at all, or fourpence a week. So in other words, it's the same thing. The servants get it, but the bosses always, who have the responsibility of administering this extremely complicated restraint policy, have to get large increases.
I realise, of course, it is not a statutory incomes policy and unlikely to be one, but...
Well, I mean, I'm nostalgic about I mean, the biggest increase the workers got since the war, if you remember, was when Ted Heath called for everybody to tighten their belts and said he would enforce this extremely strict statutory pay policy, which was so complicated that all the workers were able to go to Mallorca twice that year.
But that was, of course, shortly after, Matthew Parris, shortly after he set his face against any such thing ever happening again in Britain.
Yes. I'm inclined, though, to agree with Vincent that calling for pay restraint has become one of the commonplaces of British political life, rather like saying good morning, nice weather for the time of year. Politicians get onto a soapbox, and before they know what they've said, they've called on everybody to pay themselves less. And in the private sector, of course, it doesn't make any difference at all, and politicians realise that. They're only saying these things to the private sector to encourage the public sector. As regards the public sector, I know everybody's been saying this is a wages policy, but it isn't really. It's a reduction in the amount that the government as employer is able to pay, so that if everybody got a small increase, it would be 1.5%, but it remains quite open to civil servants and local authorities to fire people and pay the others more, or to pay some people more and other people less. It's not quite fair to say that it's a pay policy.
Well, I mean, what you're saying or implying, though, that there is in effect a statutory pay policy in the public sector because the government can enforce it, and but in the private sector they're saying, please pretend that you're having pay restraint, and it will be, as Vincent says, for the workers, but you carry on, which of course is exactly what ought to happen under the philosophy that we've been running under since 1979.
Yes, and does in the end always happen. Whatever governments may say piously about the private sector needing to keep down costs and keep down wages, in the end the private sector will only keep down costs and keep down wages when they face bankruptcy, as many of them do now face bankruptcy. I imagine we will be seeing wage freezes, people being sacked, and people not getting the increases they hope, but not because the Prime Minister says so. That's all cant.
Patrick, I think, is absolutely right to draw our attention to the Prime Minister in this respect. In the immortal words of Yogi Berra, this is déjà vu all over again. And really, it does, I think, raise questions as to whether this man is fit enough to be Prime Minister. I, as a historian, have been trying to work out, who is this man? What is he? We only get about 20 Prime Ministers a century. It's important to get it right. We can't afford to have a non-entity as Prime Minister.
Just to take that at a tangent, as I suggested, I think perhaps Mr. Major is too innocent, too nice, and that he really thinks that there is a streak in the British character that believes in fair play, because he's very keen on cricket, where they don't have a lot of fair play these days, and he believes that if he talks nicely to people, they'll do what he wants.
But the British are fair about everything except money. Do you remember the stories of the Duke and Duchess of Windsor? And whenever there was a slight shift in his investments, a panic-stricken Duke would come in and call all the servants in his palatial Paris home and explain that they couldn't have any Christmas presents or any wages for 3 weeks because he really felt that the Duchess and Her Royal Highness and himself couldn't afford to pay. And it was always the servants, who were only paid 4pence halfpenny a week anyway, who were asked to make these sacrifices.
I think the earliest pay policies, of course, Peter, I've heard of one in the 16th century.
Yes, indeed. In fact, in the war, of course, in the post-war situation, it was the Labour government. It was Mr. Attlee, wasn't it, in 47, who introduced the same pay policy. But what we're all forgetting, I think, was that all of us were saying, weren't we, pre-1979, that wage restraints and pay policies, represented the bankruptcy of British politics. And that's where we've gone back to. We've got a Prime Minister who's no good at the vision thing, and that's the road he's taking us down. As a type, he is a clerk, isn't he? He's a Victorian clerk, a Dickensian clerk. This is the politics he remembers from his early days, I suppose, in the 1960s and 1970s. And really, it is the total bankruptcy of any vision in British politics which is leading us down that road again.
Oh, I don't know about all that, but I'd like to ask Vincent. Vincent says this is just the usual thing, that we ask the servants to take a pay cut. But the idea that the public sector consists entirely of very low-paid people right at the bottom of the wages heap, so to speak. Is that right? There are a lot of civil servants who earn rather a lot of money who are going to be limited to a 1.5% increase.
Yes, but it works in exactly the same way as you suggest. The obvious thing to do, for example, in local government or in associated government agencies or quangos, the obvious thing to do is to release some of the people who aren't terribly busy just at the moment so that you can pay people more. And you'll find that this awful responsibility of making these decisions falls on rather high-paid people who somehow, at the end of the day, manage to survive always, and somehow manage to have an extra large car next year, or have their salaries inflation-proofed in some peculiar way. I find it an extraordinary thing that when selective cuts are called for, that the cuts are selected in an extremely predictable way.
Mind you, it happens in broadcasting too, Vincent.
Absolutely,
Haven't you noticed?
Right. Well, I have noticed that as well.
You and I still seem to be.
There is constant restraint in broadcasting, as Vincent and I certainly know, and Matthew.
Yes.
Well, I remember when I worked in the BBC, when I was at a by-election, this is probably why the BBC was changed, there was about 3 people between me and the Director General, but I was talking to a colleague of mine now who tells me there are now 11 people between himself and the Director General. And these are very important people who have to make decisions.
Well, despite the troubles that continue to rain down on them, members of the government go on facing life with the cool courage often associated with those who don't really know what's going on. So when this week there was a
furore over exam result list.
Were they downhearted? Not a bit of it.
Ministers shrugged off criticism yesterday of the first national publication of schools' examination results.
Well, what did the critics know about education anyway? After all, they were only
Parents, teachers, local authorities and opposition parties.
But it does appear that the SWATs in the Department of Education haven't done their homework as thoroughly as they might have. For example, the headmistress of one school threatened to sue because...
All the pupils passed at least 5 GCSEs at grades A to C, instead of the 16% shown in the tables.
And at rugby?
94% obtained at least 5 grades A to C, not the 71% printed.
I suppose they must try harder, but this isn't really the point at issue. The question is whether we're too dim to be told such things, or whether we should be treated like adults. The Guardian made the point.
Secrecy seeps from every pore of British government.
So?
The very fact that information has been released should raise a cheer.
All good liberal stuff, but the Mirror thought no secrets were actually being revealed.
The Tories have spent £1.4 million on a survey to discover what everyone with half a brain knew already.
Which is that, in general, schools in poor areas have worse results than those in well-off areas. Is that really all it tells us, Peter Stead?
Yes, I think probably that's the case. The whole exercise this week is reminding me of something I do. I spend a lot of my professional time with a red pen in my hand, making comments on essays. And one student brought an essay back to me to say he couldn't read my comments in red ink at the end, and I couldn't read it myself for a while. And of course, it said you must improve your handwriting. This is precisely, I've had my red pen out on John Patton. His report is too bulky, 108 volumes. It was too expensive. It's full of statistical errors, typographical errors, geographical errors, and this is precisely the kind of thing, of course, that has to be absolutely right. When you're trying to correct things in education, your report absolutely has to be spot on. So it is a shoddy, botched thing. On the whole, however, I agree with the publication of the figures. I think we need the figures. There is nothing wrong with the figures. What is wrong, of course, is the way that they are treated and presented. And what has been awful this week has been the awful triumphantalism, of these successful schools, in particular the school in Upminster, Coopers and Coburn. It sounds more like vintners, doesn't it? Wine importers than a school. And I think this perfectly dreadful headmaster, Mr. Churchett, who's been boasting about his pupils, his teachers, and his parents. He says we don't have an entrance test, but we do interview all parents and their children. Horrified at this notion of schools interviewing parents. I can imagine this school, Coopers and Coburn, with a big sign outside, like the coal pits and factories used to have. Last week we broke our production record. They'll probably have a graph outside showing their figures.
But this is the problem with democracy, isn't it, Peter?
Yes.
You get more information, but you can't always ensure that people will do with it what you would like.
Well, absolutely. Well, let's use these figures to good effect. On the whole, I think any old fool can be a headmaster in Upminster. The real challenge of teaching, of course, is to go into Toxteth, into Edgehill, and into parts of Mid Glamorgan in South Wales. No, these figures show quite clearly that we have major areas of deprivation. The figures are, I think, as far as GCSE are concerned, that the pass rate is twice as high amongst the sons of professional people as amongst the sons of manual people.
Well, I think you could have told them that without spending £1 million. Matthew Parris.
If the report takes us back and says, target these areas, more resources, pay people more to teach in Liverpool than in South Wales, then I think the figures would have served a very useful purpose.
Of course these figures show that, and of course we didn't need to be shown that. But these figures also show other things. They show that even in under-resourced and underprivileged areas, some schools appear to do better than others, and there may be differences between the comparative success of schools. And Peter speaks of the awful things that we've seen this week. To me, the most awful thing we've had this week is the barrage of bleating from educationalists, experts, politicians, the intelligentsia generally, on why they are capable of understanding and interpreting things which they think the general public are not capable of understanding and interpreting. The general public are perfectly capable of realising that good schools in privileged areas will anyway get better results. It's not a reason for not letting people have that data. It's a reason for encouraging people to look at the data in context, but I think that people are capable of that.
But this is, you're saying these people complain because they have vested interests. The fact that they have access to information gives them power. Now it's been handed out to others.
That's one reason, Patrick, vested interests. The other reason is the general hatred that the British intelligentsia have always had for the common people, and the general distrust that the British intelligentsia have in the judgment of the common people and the fitness of the common people to know the truth.
Is that your experience, Vincent?
Yes, it is. I'm completely with Matthew on this. I think that I don't know of a more patronising or a more secretive group of people than the educationalists in this country. I mean, if you were to draw the analogy of building a road, and you gave it to the education department of the local authority to build the road for you, they'd build a circular road and say, I'm sorry, we're just testing a new theory and we think you'll like it in time. And education authorities around the country are stuffed full of thousands upon thousands of people, and nobody knows what they do. Literally, nobody does know what they do. And when you ask them, they get extremely uppity and say you're not entitled to have that information.
But to what extent is the publication of these figures a stunt by the government, a relatively cheap stunt to divert attention from the real problems of the areas in which poor schools are?
Well, not so much a stunt as a polemic. Of course, it was presented in this way because it's part of the political process whereby the government is attempting to destroy the influence not only of educationists but also, of course, of teachers. Yes. Teachers are the most important people in education.
But that's all right, Peter. To get that argument across, we don't need educationalists to tell us it over and over again. I think that it may be a stunt. Of course, every politician will pull a stunt of some sort. But if it means giving more information, albeit in raw form and albeit in a way which people find difficult to digest, the more the better. And maybe perhaps you'll win your argument and explain why, if you give more money to people to teach in poor areas, that will produce a better education system, which I don't accept. But I mean, perhaps if we had the information and we had a proper debate by people who were informed by statistics, then maybe your arguments would win. As it is at the moment, we basically got to take your word for it.
No, I agree with the figures. I want the figures, but I want them to be used by educationalists and teachers properly, and not used by government as part of a cheap propaganda
or by ignorant
trick.
people in the public.
No, by ignorant politicians.
Well, although it's difficult to believe, I know, some secrets are even more interesting than school league tables. For example,
He shunned physical contact, save in copulation, which he craved with an intensity that struck almost every young man who witnessed it.
that is the latest description of the late John F. Kennedy, something which causes no surprise now, since so many millions of words have been written about his sexual appetite. Well, there we are. It ran in the family.
Joseph Sr. invited his mistresses to meals in Rose's presence, and father, son, and maternal grandfather shared a taste for adultery.
The dead have no rights, so you can say what you like about them and reveal their most intimate secrets. Whether you should or not is a matter raised by a literary disagreement. The Times reported,
Allegations that the editor of Philip Larkin's letters censored violently racist passages of his correspondence to protect the late poet's memory have prompted an acrimonious row.
anyone who wants to follow the detailed argument should read the correspondence columns of the Times Literary Supplement. But it can hardly be said that the recently published volume of Larkin's letters conceals his less attractive side. It's impossible to understand the problem without quoting one short, if offensive, example.
Not many niggers around here, I'm happy to say, except the packy doctor next door.
Should we know that Larkin wrote in this way? Or should we know, for example, that the sculptor and typographer Eric Gill numbered among his hobbies?
Child molesting, voyeurism, and bestiality.
Well, announcing this kind of thing seems to be an essential part of modern biographical work. But the Times thinks a line should be drawn.
There can be no public right to read everything, not even everything written by a famous author.
And the conclusion is,
Honest censorship is a function of a literary executor.
Matthew Parris, sometimes it seems biographies and books of that kind are filled with very little except discreditable matters. Do you think we should know them?
Of course we should know them, and here we go again, the usual brigade saying that people shouldn't know, that there's information that should somehow be kept from people. All this rubbish about Larkin, it arises from the old lie, which I suppose Keats gave particular prominence to, that there's some connection between truth and beauty, and that things which are good will also be moral, that things which are creative will also be right. And because we want to admire Larkin as a poet, there's a whole section of the literary society that wants to believe that he was a nice or interesting man whose opinions will have been correct on certain specially selected topics. And of course, he wasn't a particularly nice man, and his opinions weren't correct. His opinions were offensive, and nastiness and vice and prejudice and all the dark side of human character is just as important part of the creative process as the good side, as the nice side, and we do need to know about it. It brings Larkin to life. It helps you to understand him when you understand the physical aversions, the fears, the hatreds, the prejudices that he had. I'm all in favour of knowing all we can about everything and everybody. The truth can only help.
One of the problems here, though, is, isn't it, a question of context and of tone, because you may read these things literally. Larkin is not here to set them in context or to explain himself or otherwise, or to say, yes, he agreed with all this. But, people say these kind of things, many people say these kind of things, not meaning them.
Oh, he meant them. You can tell he meant them. Why do we want to try and defend Larkin's political or views on race? He was obviously a racist. From what he said, Larkin was a racist. And if that gives offence to readers of The Guardian who wish to like Larkin and not to believe that he was a racist, well, too bad for them. Anything which puts Guardian readers into moral agonies must be right.
I was reading this week, home is so sad it stays as it was left, shaped to the comfort of the last to go, as if to win them back. Instead, bereft of anyone to please, it withers so. Beautiful, beautiful poetry. Larkin had these wonderful moments, and I hope people go on reading that poetry for a long time to come. But he was a dreadful man, he was an awful man, and I think the less we know about him, the better.
Oh, well, no, the more we know, perhaps.
You made a jump.
This is why I disagree with Matthew. Of course, people should know that he was a rather sad man, a racist, very angry, stayed at home drinking whiskey, playing jazz, and so on. But you can say that in 10 pages. A little essay. What is needed is balance. And biographers, I think, should aim for those little character sketches in essays. 20, 30 pages is enough to say that kind of thing. What we don't need is 500 pages of correspondence of these letters, and then a 500-page biography, which is bound to.
Well, we don't have to buy it.
Peter, I think you're a natural censor. That's the problem. See, what I don't want is balance. I want no balance at all. I just want information.
Yes.
And the point is, I have the right to select and to balance my information, not the biographer. I'll tell you, I had an experience recently with the new biography of Benjamin Britten, which I found most illuminating because it does go into a lot of his sexuality and does deal a great deal with the inherent violence in aspects of his sexuality. And it enabled me to understand for the first time much of Peter Grimes or Billy Budd or The Turn of the Screw. It illuminated his music to know more about his character and his sexual character.
Now, Vincent, it's true, isn't it, that the early biography of Maynard Keynes, The Economist, made no mention of his homosexuality. And more recent
biography. That was a straight
biography.
piece of political censorship. People felt that the economy of the country and the destiny of economic affairs shouldn't be placed in the hands of a homosexual.
But I mean,
and that was a straight piece of political censorship.
But so what? I mean, the fact that we know that about Keynes does not actually say very much about his economic views.
But no, it doesn't. But the whole point of the act of censorship, the early acts of censorship about Maynard Keynes's sexuality, were brought about people like Peter, who said, well,
yes.
on balance, it's best not to know this. I will decide for you. I'm afraid you can't do that.
Acts of censorship are generally promulgated, not in the belief that information is not relevant, and therefore people shouldn't have it, but in the belief that the information is relevant and would influence people, and therefore people shouldn't have it.
But the problem here, Matthew, you see, it seems to me, is that, again, of context, it's the discreditable dominates what we are told about these people. There isn't very much balance these days, or the more sensational it is, the better publishers like it, the better authors like it very often.
If the discreditable dominates, then the discreditable has discredited it. If it has the power to discredit, then it's clearly information which we need to know.
I'll give you another example.
If the knowing of it doesn't discredit, then there's no harm in our knowing it.
I'll give you another example of that, which is Wagner's music and the argument about Wagner and his alleged anti-Semitic tendencies and the fact that Hitler loved him. The struggle between those who are opposed to Wagner on political grounds and the strength of Wagner's music has been one of the most fascinating of the 20th century.
Absolutely.
And the fact is that Wagner's music predominated over the bigotry.
Yes.
I love this kind of quasi-middlebrow knowledge of these middle-class intellectual gossips. Keynes, going back to Keynes. Keynes is one of the greatest writers of English, one of the great writers in the 20th century. I want people to read that. In 3 lines, they can be told about his sex life. It's more important that they should understand what his views were about. But for every one person who will try to read Keynes, there will be 90 reading this biography, thinking they're understanding Keynes, whereas in fact it's just high-class
Peter,
gossip.
let me give you a completely different viewpoint on that. I'm gay myself, and I'm proud that Keynes was gay, and I'm sorry that the whole thing was concealed, because to me, it's interesting information that someone who evidently had such a brilliant mind and such a steady judgment, and in fact, who controlled the destinies of so many millions of people in many ways, that such a man was a practicing homosexual. I'm pleased that that's out. I wouldn't want either to suppress it or to minimize the impact of the information.
And Matthew Parris, Peter Stead, Vincent Hanna, thank you very much for joining me today. I'll be back with T-Junction at the same time next week. But until then, goodbye.
Patrick Hannan presented T-Junction. The readers were Leslie Rooney and Philip Manicum, and the programme was produced in Cardiff by Richard Thomas.